Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to talk about a very specific kind of positional weakness in chess. We're going to be talking about doubled pawns. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So in this position, black has doubled pawns. As a matter of fact, black's pawns are a little bit worse than doubled. They're both doubled and isolated, which is a double kind of bad thing. So he's got doubled and isolated pawns, and he's also got an additional isolated pawn over here. So when we talk about positional weaknesses in chess, we're talking about things like doubled pawns, isolated pawns, backwards pawns, weak squares, things of this nature. These are positional weaknesses in chess. So why are these things so bad? Why is it so terrible to have doubled pawns? Well, if you want to know why a doubled pawn is bad or why an isolated pawn is bad, the best way to understand it is to look at an endgame like this, where we have a very simplified position where there's not a whole lot else going on. Like one side can't just whip up an attack on the other side of the board to compensate for his weakness. In this case, the weakness is going to get taken advantage of. As a matter of fact, in this position, black's position should just be completely lost if white plays correctly. But white needs to understand why he has an advantage, he needs to understand why these pawns are weak, and he needs to understand how to take advantage of it. So to fully understand that, I think it's also important to fully understand how to just play a position where there's no weaknesses in the pawn structure. So we're going to take a look at this other position where the pawns are even, and there's actually no weaknesses in the pawn structure for either side. Now in this position, if everybody plays properly, this position should just be a draw. But in order to achieve that draw, you actually have to kind of understand a little bit about what's going on in every basic king and pawn endgame. And one of the things that's going on here is we have this thing called the zone of the pawn. Now those are the three squares to the left or to the right of a pawn in a king and pawn endgame, especially when the pawns are on the same side of the board, where the kings kind of have to fight for jockeying for position to get to those pawns. In this case, with this c pawn for black, the c6 pawn, the zone of that pawn is d6, e6, f6, and the zone of white's c4 pawn is d4, e4, f4. So if black were to manage to get his king to one of these highlighted squares, white would no longer be able to defend his pawn long term. And the same is true for black. So I actually witnessed this game get played years ago between two Class C players, and they were playing this position, and they just figured it's a draw, we can play whatever we want, and they were just blitzing out moves, and I watched kind of horrified as the evaluation basically changed hands several times as they each in turn managed to obtain a losing position. The person playing the white pieces played this horrifyingly bad mistake. He played the move pawn to c5, and if you can see what I've just highlighted right here, one of the things that move just did is it changed the zone of that pawn from d4, e4, f4. Suddenly that zone has moved to d5, e5, f5. Now all black has to do is get to one of these three squares, and he can win the game. Now, as it turned out, neither player knew how to play an endgame to save their life, so black retreated his king to c7, and then several mistakes continued from there. It was back and forth, and somehow it still ended in a draw, but each side probably had a win at some point. It was just ridiculous to watch. But here, this is very easy for black to win. Black can just simply take, b takes c5, b takes c5, king to e6, threatening to get to the very outskirts of this zone. Black is threatening to play king to c4, and king to c4 would essentially be game over. So here we have king e4 trying to keep black out, but then black plays a5 and gains the opposition. This means that white's king has to give way and has to give black one of these squares. So if you don't fully understand why this is completely losing, just take a look at what happens. If we give up just one of these squares, even the square on the very outside, right here, so you wouldn't think that's a big deal, I'm in this square. But basically, I am squeezing that king out of defending that pawn. There is nothing this king can do to keep this king from his march. King over one, king captures pawn. It's just going to happen. So the king would move, for example, king over. Where are we going? We can't go here, we can't go here, we can't go here, we can't go here. We're just moving somewhere. The king goes here, and then on the very next move, the king will take the pawn, and that's going to be it. That's called getting to the zone of the pawn. So why is this critical? So in this position, like, the draw would just be repeat moves. Each side would just go back and forth. So why is this critical when we're talking about doubled pawns? What does this have to do with doubled pawns? Well, let's go back to that doubled pawn position where the pawns for black are doubled and isolated. You can see that I've had 3 squares highlighted at the beginning of this video, and now maybe it's becoming more apparent why I have these 3 squares highlighted. Because the zone in this position is a little bit different, because the pawns are so weak in front. The zone can actually kind of extend to the front of this pawn. Probably not all the way down to c3 that I had highlighted, but definitely to c4, where he can't make pawn moves. He can't move his pawn up without it getting captured, and he can't make safety moves with his king. If I can just get my king in front of this pawn and threaten to capture it by playing king to c5, I'm effectively doing the same thing. I'm squeezing this king out of this pawn. So, can we still mess this position up? Interestingly enough, of course we can. We can still mess this position up. Basically, just about any king move here is going to win this position. For example, I could play king c4, and let's say they try to eliminate this pawn because it starts becoming obvious that I'm going to squeeze you out of this square. Like, you could play a6, I could play c3, we could play king back, and we could play here. So see, you're getting squeezed out. So it's going to be blatantly obvious at a certain point. You're getting squeezed out of that pawn, and I'm just going to take it. It's the same zone, but the zone is now in front of the pawn, which is just, it's nearly impossible to defend a zone that's in front of the pawn when you also have to defend the zone that's next to the pawn. So when you have a doubled pawn or an isolated pawn, or in this case doubled isolated pawns, you have zones for your pawns all over the place all of a sudden. It's not just to the left of the pawn, it's also in front, it's also to the side. It's basically impossible to defend all of the places where your opponent can try to get to your pawn. So what if we see this coming? What if we try something else? So we could try something like c5. Well, look at this. If they play c5, I don't even have to take it. I can just push this pawn. This pawn is still hanging. How are we going to defend this pawn long term? There's not really a way to defend it. We can even eliminate our doubled pawn. I can play something like c3, takes, and guess what? That king now has to move away from the defense of that pawn. Once the king moves away from the defense of that pawn, I simply take it. Now it's just an isolated pawn sitting all by itself, and the king has to move away from the defense, or we have to push this pawn, and that's it. That's going to be the end of the game. The king's going to move away, and we're going to win. So what's interesting enough is, with all this going on, you would think, okay, white should just be completely winning. This can't be a very difficult endgame for white to play. How hard could it be to possibly make a mistake here? Well, actually, it's relatively easy to make a mistake because of the weakness of doubled pawns and the weakness of doubled isolated pawns, and they're actually so weak that you can use them as a drawing tactic. And what I mean by that is, let's say white makes the mistake of just saying, hey, I'm winning. Anything I do, it doesn't matter. I'm going to be winning because you have double isolated pawns. So I'm going to push my pawn up the board. I'm going to play c4, and I'm just going to advance my pawn very, very rapidly. This is black to move and draw. So pause the video, see if you can find it. The move is pawn to c5 check. And that immediately draws the game, because now the situation is reversed. After b captures c5, we have king c6, and it's white that has the doubled pawns, and it's black that's inside of the zone of these doubled pawns, and it's actually white that will eventually be forced to move his king and give up that pawn on c5. This allows black to completely equalize. White doesn't have enough moves to save. Like if he plays a5, we just play a6, the white king has to give way, king takes c5, and now the position is equal. Each side has the same number of pawns, and both sides have isolated pawns in the exact same places, and nobody can make progress. Actually, black's position here is a smidge better. So this is actually advantage. It went from, white had a completely winning advantage to black is equalized, and black is actually doing a little bit better because white's on the defensive, but the position at that point should be approximately level. White should still be able to equalize here as long as he doesn't do anything silly or anything crazy. But basically, that's how these positions work. That's why doubled pawns are weak. If you get a position like this in a game, really the correct thing to do is just take your king, plant it in the zone of this pawn, just play something like king c4, get ready to play king c5, and you're eventually just going to out-tempo this king away from his doubled or isolated pawns, and you're going to win the game quite easily. Okay, so that's why doubled pawns are weak. That's why they're a huge positional weakness in chess, and this is how we take advantage of them in a very basic endgame. And this is also one of the ways that we try to take advantage of them, in middle games and openings, etc., because really all parts of the game are connected in chess. So anyways, I hope you found this video enjoyable. I hope you learned a lot about chess, and please hit that like button, hit subscribe, and click on your notification icon. Thank you very much for watching.